Right. Moving on to the Section 3, Transcendental Exposition of the Concept of Space. By transcendental exposition, I understand the explanation of a concept as a principle from which the possibility of other synthetic a priori knowledge can be understood. Okay, for this purpose, it is required, 1. That knowledge of this kind actually flows from a given concept. 2. That this knowledge is possible only under the presupposition of a given mode of explaining this concept. Okay, so transcendental exposition, he's saying, is effectively the getting of additional knowledge from a concept. I think that, he goes on to use geometry. So you have the idea of a triangle, and you get a bunch of, ideas from the concept of a triangle. He's saying that knowledge of this kind actually has to flow from that concept, and the knowledge is possible only under the presupposition of a given mode of explaining this concept. Not sure exactly what he means by that, but he goes on. Geometry is a science which determines the properties of space synthetically, and yet a priori. What then must the representation of space be if such a knowledge is to be possible? Okay, so geometry is effectively, the study of kind of two-dimensional space. I guess it could be three-dimensional. So what must the representation of space, so he's kind of, I think he's saying like the appearance, as Kant has defined it. What is knowledge of that going to be, if not something that we can, determine synthetic or like a priori, and can then synthetically determine things from it? Space must originally be intuition. For from a mere concept it is impossible to obtain propositions which go beyond the concepts such as we do, however, obtain in geometry. This intuition must, however, be encountered in us a priori, that is, prior to any perception of an object, and must therefore be pure, not empirical intuition. For all geometrical propositions are apodictic, that is, connected with the consciousness of their necessity, as for instance the proposition that space has only 3 dimensions. Such propositions cannot be empirical judgments or judgments of experience, nor can they be inferred from such judgments. Okay, so effectively, things that are true geometrically are true by necessity, like, we are able to determine them definitively, and therefore, like, we don't need to experience them in order to determine them. And space is like that. It's a priori. It exists in the mind, and then we can synthetically make determinations based upon it. How then can outer intuition, which precedes the objects themselves, and in which the concept of these objects can be determined a priori, dwell in the mind? Evidently not otherwise than insofar as the intuition has its seat merely in the subject, as the subject's formal constitution of being affected by objects, and of thereby receiving an immediate representation, that is, intuition of them, and therefore only as form of outer sense in general. Okay, it exists somewhere within us. I don't know why. I'm going to read that once more. How then can an outer intuition, like something we experience, which precedes the objects themselves, right, and in which the concept of these objects can be determined? Okay, so if you're picturing a triangle, you can determine things about a triangle before you actually experience it. A priori, dwell in the mind. How can that dwell in the mind? Evidently not otherwise than insofar as the intuition has its seat merely in the subject. Right. So my intuition of that triangle is actually in my mind, not in reality, necessarily. At least it can precede reality, me experiencing it. As the subject's formal constitution of being affected by objects. So in other words, there is some form within my mind that makes up how a triangle is constituted in the world. So a priori I know it before I actually experience it. And thereby receiving an immediate representation, that is, intuition of them, like being presented with them. Okay. And therefore only as form of the outer sense in general. Our explanation is therefore the only one that makes the possibility of geometry as a form of synthetic a priori knowledge intelligible. Okay, so like we are able to determine things apodictically in geometry because we are able to intuit these things before we experience them, and then synthetically draw conclusions based on them. And that must be because the intuition, like the form of that, exists in our mind a priori, of space. Okay. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I think that's what he's saying. Any explanation which fails to account for this possibility, although it may seem to be somewhat similar, can best be distinguished from our own by these criteria. Okay, that's the end of that section. The next section is conclusions from the above concepts. And I'll be honest, this one always, I don't know. I don't find it to be, I find it to be confusing. A. Space does not represent any property of things in themselves, nor does it represent them in their relation to one another. I.e., space does not represent any determination which would adhere to objects themselves, and that would remain even if we abstracted from all subjective conditions of intuition. Okay, so this is Newton and Leibniz both rejected in one sentence. And Kant's taking the position that, like, effectively, space is nothing without humans to experience it, and humans experiencing stuff would be nothing without space. I think that there's kind of like I think this is kind of teased out a little bit more further into the book, but I think that's kind of the position he takes. He continues, for no determinations, whether absolute or relative, can be intuited prior to the existence of the things to which they belong. And hence, none can be intuited a priori. I gotta read that whole thing again. He lost me the last sentence. Wait. Space does not represent any property of things in themselves, nor does it represent them in their relation to one another. I.e., space does not represent any determination which would adhere to objects themselves, and that would remain even if we abstracted from all subjective conditions of intuition. Okay. For no determinations, whether absolute or relative, can be intuited prior to the existence of the things to which they belong. And hence, none can be intuited a priori. I don't know. I don't understand that. So if it's absolute, if the existence of space is absolute, I think what he's saying is, if that were true, then we couldn't intuit things about space without it actually existing or probably experiencing it. But we can do that, so therefore space is not like strictly absolute. It kind of needs our participation and understanding in order for it to exist the way it does. And then the relative nature makes a little bit more sense, because it's like, until we actually perceive those two objects next to each other or existing in space, their kind of relative distance to one another or relationship to one another is kind of meaningless and could not be intuited, prior to actually experiencing them. Okay, section B. Space is nothing but the form of all appearances of outer sense, i.e., it is the subjective condition of sensibility, under which alone outer intuition is possible for us. Since then, the receptivity of the subject to be affected by objects must necessarily precede all intuitions of these objects, we can understand how the form of all appearances can be given in the mind prior to all actual perception. Okay, since receptivity, like the possibility of experiencing something, exists prior to actually experiencing it in space, it must be that the ability to experience it, i.e. the forms, must exist in the subject that's able to perceive prior to actually experiencing it. And so be given a priori, prior to experience. And how, as a pure intuition in which all objects must be determined. And how, as a pure intuition in which all objects must be determined, it can contain, prior to all experience, principles which determine the relations among these objects. It is therefore only the human standpoint that we can speak of space, extended objects, etc. If we depart from the subjective condition under which alone we can gain outer intuition, namely, as far as we ourselves may be affected by objects, the representation of space means nothing whatsoever. Okay, this predicate is ascribed to things only insofar as they appear to us, that is, only to objects of sensibility. The constant form of this receptivity, which we call sensibility, is a necessary condition of all relations in which objects can be intuited as outside us. And when we abstract from these objects, then the form of that receptivity is a pure intuition which we call space. As the special conditions of our sensibility cannot be made the conditions of the possibility of things, but only their appearances, we may indeed say that space comprehends all things which appear to us externally, but not all things in themselves. Sorry, I have to go back. The constant form of this receptivity, which we call sensibility, is a necessary condition of all relations in which objects can be intuited as outside us. And when we abstract from these objects, then the form of that receptivity is a pure intuition, which we call space. Okay. As the special conditions of our sensibility cannot be made the conditions of the possibility of things, but only of their appearances, we may indeed say that space comprehends all things which appear to us externally, but not all things in themselves, intuited or not, or intuited by any subject whatsoever. So space contains appearances, but we're not sure if space actually contains representations of things in themselves, or at least we can't know what those things in themselves might be, and space doesn't necessarily present them to us. For we cannot judge in regard to the intuitions of other thinking beings, whether they are subject to the same conditions which limit our intuition, and which, for us, are universally valid. If we add the limitation of a judgment to the concept of a subject, the judgment gains unconditional validity. The proposition, all things are side by side in space, is valid under the limitation that these things are taken as objects of sensible intuition. The proposition, all things are side by side in space, is valid under the limitation that these things are taken as objects of our sensible intuition. Okay? If here I add the condition to the concept and say all things as outer appearances are side by side in space, then the rule obtains universal and unlimited validity. Okay? Our discussions therefore establish the reality, i.e. the objective validity of space with regard to everything that can come to us externally as an object. And at the same time establish the ideality of space, that would be things in themselves, with regard to things when considered in themselves by reason, that is, without taking into account the constitution of our sensibility. Okay, so the sensibility presents us with things that are valid as appearances, but it does not necessarily present us with things in themselves. I don't know. I'm not fully getting exactly what the point is here. I thought I was there for a second, but then I lost it. All things as outer appearances are side by side in space, and then a rule obtains universal and unlimited validity. As outer appearances. So, considering them as outer appearances as opposed to as things in themselves, it obtains universal validity because it's actually true of the appearances that we're able to intuit and experience. But as an overarching thing, discussing a proposition, considering things in themselves, all things are side by side in space, we don't know if that's true. But it's valid, he says, the limitation that these things are taken as objects of our sensible intuition. But I didn't think we could really understand or intuit things in themselves. I'm going to move on. Our discussions therefore establish the reality, I know I already read this, but i.e. the objective validity of space with regard to everything that can come to us externally as an object, and at the same time establish the ideality of space with regard to things when considered in themselves by reason, that is, without taking into account the constitution of our sensibility. Okay, so the ideality of space doesn't take into account our sensibility, but we do have an idea of objective reality based on our sensations. That would be appearances, like what we actually experience. But we don't get things in themselves. Hence we assert the empirical reality of space as far as all possible outer experience is concerned. But at the same time we assert the transcendental ideality. That is to say, we assert that space is nothing once we leave out of consideration the condition of the possibility of all experience, and accept space as something underlying things in themselves. Of course I have to read that once more, at least. Hence we assert the empirical reality of space as far as all possible outer experience is concerned, but at the same time we assert its transcendental ideality. Okay, so empirical reality would be what we experience, but we also assert its transcendental ideality, meaning its its existence in itself, like things in itself. That is to say, we assert that space is nothing once we leave out of consideration the condition of the possibility of all experience, and accept space as something underlying things in themselves. With the exception of space, there is no other subjective representation referring to something external that would be called a priori objective. And from none of them can we derive synthetic a priori propositions, as we can from the intuition of space. So space is weird, has a unique, position in the world. Strictly speaking, therefore, they can claim no ideality at all, like understanding things in themselves. I need to constantly remind myself that transcendental idealism / ideality, etc., is considering things in themselves, because I find it to be a kind of intimidating concept that I don't reflexively understand it yet. Okay, strictly speaking, therefore, they can claim no ideality at all, even though they agree with the representation of space in this respect, that they belong only to the subjective constitution of the kind of sense involved, for instance, of sight, of hearing, or of feeling, through the sensations of colors, sounds, and heat. All these, however, being merely sensations and not intuitions, do not allow us to know any object, least of all a priori. Okay. What I have said just now is intended only to prevent people from imagining that they can illustrate the asserted ideality of space by means of examples, which are altogether insufficient, such as colors, taste, etc. These cannot be rightly considered qualities of things, but only as alterations in our subject, alterations which may, indeed, be different in different people. This reminds me of Locke, like primary and secondary what's the word you use? Substances, I think. So like primary things would be extension, weight, like things that are kind of universally true, and secondary substances, or I don't know, remember the exact word, but secondary qualities would be taste, smell, color. Locke taking the position that like the secondary ones are like not really real, they're just what things that we perceive, and like they don't really exist outside of our perception. I think Locke, well, he's an empiricist. I probably shouldn't get hung up on Locke right now. But I did read what was it, an essay concerning human understanding, and it's really good and interesting. I read an abridged version. It was still like 470 pages, something like that. But anyway. For in this case, something which originally is itself only appearance, for instance, a rose, is taken by the empirical understanding for a thing in itself, which nevertheless, with regard to color, can appear differently to every eye. Okay, so what he's saying is like the empirical experience of a rose, it isn't a thing in itself, right? Because we say one person says the rose is red, another person says it's maroon, another says it's brown. So like that can't be like our empirical experience of that rose cannot be understanding it as a thing in itself if different people are able to experience it in different ways. That's like totally contrary to the idea of understanding a thing in itself. The transcendental concept of appearances in space, on the contrary, is a critical reminder that nothing intuited in space is a thing in itself, and that space is not a form of things which might belong to them in themselves, but that objects in themselves are not known to us at all, and that what we call external objects are nothing but mere representations of our sensibility, the form of which is space. Okay, things existing in the world, we don't know as things in themselves, and they are merely things that are impinging on our sensibility, and they are able to do so with the underlying form that is space. That's how we get them to exist outside of us, or understand that they do. The true correlate of sensibility, that is, the thing in itself, is not known, nor can it be known at all through these representations, nor do we ever ask any questions about it in experience. All right. Next is the Transcendental Aesthetic, Section 2 of Time. Frankly, I'm much more intrigued by the time aspect, and nobody talks about it. I'm sure somebody talks about it, but I think the arguments are generally the same, is what people say. But, and so that's generally what I hear people say about it. But it seems much more interesting to me. Anyway. And it's much more difficult, I find, but okay. Metaphysical Section 4, Metaphysical Exposition of the Concept of Time. 1. Time is not an empirical concept that in some way has been derived from an experience, for neither simultaneity nor succession would enter our perception if the representation of time did not underlie them a priori. Okay. My initial response is why? Only when this representation is presupposed can we represent to ourselves a number of things as existing at one and the same time, simultaneously, or at different times, successively. So only once we kind of represent to ourselves the idea of time, can we think of things as simultaneous or successive. Okay, I'm not sure if that's true, but sure. 2. Time is a necessary representation that underlies all intuitions. We cannot remove time itself from appearances in general, though we can quite well take away appearances from time. Okay, so there can effectively the space argument. There can be we can't imagine a thing that is outside of space, but we can imagine a space with no things in it. Same thing with time. Okay. Time, therefore, is given a priori. In time alone is the actuality of appearances possible. In time alone is the actuality of appearances possible. All appearances may vanish, but time itself, as the universal condition of their possibility, cannot be removed. This a priori necessity also grounds the possibility of apodictic principles of the relations of time. Okay. Or of axioms about time in general. Time has one dimension only. Different times are not simultaneous but successive. This is similar to the space argument that there aren't infinite spaces but only one space, and we chop it up in infinite ways potentially. These principles cannot be derived from experience, because experience cannot impart to them either strict universality or apodictic certainty. We should only be able to say that common perception teaches us that it is so, but not that it must be so. These principles are valid as rules, under which alone experiences are possible. They instruct us prior to experience, not by means of experience. Okay. 4. Time is not a discursive or what is called a general concept, but a pure form of sensible intuition. Different times are only parts of one and the same time, and that representation, which can be given only through a single object is an intuition. Moreover, the proposition that different times cannot be simultaneous cannot be derived from a general concept. The proposition is synthetic. It cannot have its origin in concepts only. Hence it is contained immediately in the intuition and representation of time. Okay. 5. To say that time is infinite means no more than that every determinate magnitude of time is possible only through limitations on one single underlying time. The original representation time must, therefore, be given as unlimited. But when the parts of themselves and every magnitude of an object can be represented determinately only through limitation, the whole representation cannot be given through concepts, for those contain only partial representations. On the contrary, they must be based on immediate intuition. Okay, these are, clearly what people are talking about when they talk about the arguments being the same for time. And it kind of makes sense. Section 5, Transcendental Exposition of the Concept of Time. I may here refer to number 3, where, for the sake of brevity, I have placed what is properly transcendental under the heading of metaphysical exposition. Talking about section 3, I think that discusses... Which one is section 3? Yeah, section 3 is the transcendental exposition of the concept of space. Here I may add that the concept of alteration, and with it the concept of motion as alteration of place, is possible only through and in the representation of time, and that if this representation were not an inner a priori intuition, then no concept, whatever it may be, could make comprehensible the possibility of alteration. That is, of a combination of contradictorily opposed predicates in one and the same object. For instance, the existence and non-existence of one and the same thing in one and the same place. It is only in time that both contradictorily opposed determinations can be met with the same thing, that is, one after another, the other. Our concept of time, therefore, explains the possibility of as much synthetic a priori knowledge as is exhibited, by no means infertile, general doctrine of motion. Okay, kind of similar to what he explained in geometry, but via time, as kind of it makes the possibility of a priori synthetic judgments possible. Section 6. Conclusions from these subjects. A. Time is not something which exists by itself, or which adheres to things as an objective determination. not something, therefore, that might remain when abstraction is made from all subject conditions of our intuition of them. For in the former case, it would be something actual, if it existed in itself, and yet not be an actual object. Like time, you can't really grab it, or like, whatever. In the latter case, which adheres to the things as an objective determination. That's what it would be. So in the latter case, time could not, as a determination or order, adhering to things themselves, precede the objects as their condition, and could not be known and intuited a priori through synthetic propositions. Okay, so it's not something that exists by itself, because it would be something real but not an actual object. Couldn't you say the same about I guess you could say the same about space, or which adheres to things as an objective determination, not something, therefore, that might remain when abstraction is made from all subjective conditions. So essentially the relational aspect again. And he's saying kind of the preceding versus succeeding argument. Like, we couldn't have ideas about time or experience time before we had an understanding of time, because time is necessary to actually experience everything, I think is kind of what he's going for. But this last is quite possible if time is nothing but the subjective condition under which alone all intuitions can take place within us. For in that case, this form of inner intuition can be represented prior to its objects, that is, represented a priori. Okay. B. Time is nothing but the form of inner sense, that is, of our intuition of ourselves and of our inner state. Time cannot be a determination of outer appearances. As opposed to belonging to shape or location, etc., time determines the relation of representations in our inner state. And exactly because this inner intuition supplies no shape, we try to make up for this deficiency by means of analogies, and represent the succession of time by a line progressing to infinity, in which the manifold constitutes a series of only one dimension. And from the properties of this line we infer all the properties of time, with this one exception, that while the parts of the line are simultaneous, those of time are always successive. Okay? From this it is clear that the representation of time is itself an intuition, for all temporal relations allow of being expressed in an outer intuition. Okay, he had me up until that last part. Okay. From this it is clear that the representation of time is itself an intuition, as opposed to concept. For all temporal relations allow of being expressed in an outer intuition. I'm just going to move on. I'm not 100% sure. C. Time is the formal a priori condition of all appearances in general. Space is the pure form of all outer intuition, is restricted. Space as the pure form of all outer intuition is restricted as an a priori condition to just outer appearances. Right? But as all representations, whether they have as their objects outer things or not, themselves belong, as determinations of the mind, to our inner state, whereas this inner state is subject to the formal condition of inner intuition, and therefore to time. So time is an a priori condition of all appearance in general. It is the immediate condition of inner appearances of our souls, and thereby the mediate condition also of outer appearances. Okay, because we experience time inwardly, and we're constantly experiencing it. Therefore, it is kind of like the underlying condition of all experience, inner and outer. I think if I'm able to say a priori that all outer appearances are in space and are determined a priori according to the relations of space, I can, in accordance with the principle of inner sense, make the universal assertion that all appearances in general, that is, all objects of the senses, are in time and stand necessarily in relations of time. If we abstract from the manner in which we intuit ourselves internally, and in which, by means of this intuition, we also take up all outer intuitions into the power of representation, and if, hence, we take objects as they may be in themselves, then time is nothing. Gotta read that again. If we abstract from the manner in which we intuit ourselves internally, so abstract from the manner in which we intuit ourselves internally, so effectively abstract from how we experience time, according to Kant, and in which, by means of this intuition, we also take up all outer intuitions into our power of representation, and if, hence, we take objects as they may be in themselves, effectively outside of space and time, like, so we're not considering them in time, and we're not considering them, we're considering them as our representations of them. And if, hence, we take objects as they may be in themselves, then time is nothing. Okay, so if we actually experience space and time effectively, and things in themselves as they actually are, then time is nothing. Would that be because we're having like the true experience of things, and that would be in some way transcend the time? I'm not sure I understand that. Time has objective validity. I think he's about to explain it. We'll see. Time has objective validity only with respect to appearances, because these are already things which we accept as objects of our senses. But without that, time is nothing. Okay, I'm going to restart that sentence. I'm sorry. I'm going to stop editorializing so much. Or maybe not. I don't know. Time has objective validity only with respect to appearances, because these are already things which we accept as objects of our senses. And effectively, because we are human and experience time inwardly, as Kant claims, to the extent that we encounter appearances and accept them as objects of our senses, that we experience them in time. But if we don't do that, so Kant goes on, but time is no longer objective if we abstract from the sensibility of our intuition. That is to say, from that mode of representation which is peculiar to us, and speak of things in general. Okay, so like effectively, like the only way we know things in the world is not in and of themselves. We don't know things in themselves, according to Kant, right? And the only way we know those things is as appearances. The underlying form of them as external things is space, and the underlying internal aspect of them is time. But if we were to actually experiencing them as things in themselves, it would effectively be us experiencing them outside of ourselves, like outside of those things, because those things underlie all of our experience. And so if we were to experience things in themselves, time and he's just talking about time now, but like time and probably space would become, as we know it, irrelevant, because they are defined as our experience of them now. Okay, I kind of get it. I think. It feels like I get it. I'm getting something. Okay. Time has, I'm rereading, but time has objective validity only with respect to appearances, because these are already things which we accept as objects of our senses. But time is no longer objective if we abstract from the sensibility of our intuition, that is to say, from that mode of representation which is peculiar to us, and speak of things in general. Time is therefore merely a subjective condition of our human intuition, which is always sensible, that is, so far as we are affected by objects, but in itself, apart from the subject, it is nothing. Okay, I think that makes sense. Nevertheless, with respect to all appearances, that is, to all things which can enter into our experience, time is necessarily objective. We cannot say that all things are in time, for in the concept of things in general we abstract from all modes of their intuition, and therefore from the very condition under which time belongs to our representation of objects. If, therefore, the condition is added to the concept, and if we say that all things as appearances, as objects of sensible intuition, are in time, then the principle has its full objective correctness and a priori universality. Okay. So if we take things like outside of space and time, things in themselves, as they exist, then, time and space are irrelevant. But if we put them back into it, then it restores time, presumably space, in its a priori universality, because it's back within the realm of our experience and how we I don't want to say experience again, but experience space and time. Okay, I kind of feel like I'm getting this. Moving on. What we insist on, therefore, is the empirical reality of time, as opposed to the empirical or ideality of time. So empirical reality of time, like as we experience it. That is, its objective validity with regard to all objects which might ever be given to our senses. And as our intuition is always sensible, no object can ever be given to us in experience which is not subject to the conditions of time. What we deny, on the other hand, is that time has any claim to absolute reality. That is to say, we deny, without taking into account the form of our sensible intuition, that time should by itself be a condition or property adhering to things absolutely. For such properties which belong to things in themselves can never be given to us through the senses. Right, we don't experience things in themselves. Sorry, I keep saying that. This, then, is what constitutes the transcendental ideality of time. Right. Ideality meaning things in themselves. According to which, if we abstract from the subjective conditions of our sensible intuition, time is nothing, and cannot be regarded as subsisting or as inhering in the objects in themselves, aside from their relation to our intuition. This ideality of time, however, as well as that of space, should not be confounded with the subreptions of sensations, because in that case we presuppose that the appearance itself in which such predicates inhere has objective reality. Got to reread that, sorry. This ideality of time, however, meaning understanding time in itself, however, as well as that of space, should not be confounded with the subreptions. I don't know what subreptions means, so I'm going to look it up. Okay. subreptions. Subreptions. Subreption refers to the act of obtaining something, often a benefit or grant, through the deliberate concealment or misrepresentation of facts. Ooh, it's a legal concept from Roman law. In the canon of the Catholic Church, as well as a philosophical concept. Okay. So the misrepresentations of time, that motherfucker. Reading again. This ideality of time, however, as well as that of space, should not be confounded with the subreptions, misrepresentations, of sensations, because in that case we presuppose that the appearance itself, in which such predicates in here has objective reality. In the case of time, such objective reality is entirely missing except insofar as it is merely empirical, that is, insofar as the object itself is regarded merely as appearance. On this subject, see the note above, in the first section on space. Okay, I kind of get it. I feel like I kind of get it. Feels good. Let's see how much we got left. In the Transcendental Aesthetic. Oh, wow. What section is this? I'm kind of hoping to push through it, but then the general observations on the Transcendental Aesthetic is pretty long. So it goes up to 84. I guess it's not that long. I don't know, 10 pages of Kant is kind of a lot. It's 13 pages. We'll see what we can do. Elucidation. Against this theory, which admits the empirical reality of time, but denies the absolute and transcendental reality, even intelligent men have protested so unanimously that I suppose that every reader who is unaccustomed to these considerations may naturally be of the same opinion. What they object to is this. Alterations, they say, are real. This is proved by the change of our own representations, even if all outer appearances and their alterations be denied. Alterations, however, are possible only in time, and therefore time must be something real. Okay. Good argument, straw man. The answer to this is easy enough. I grant the whole argument. Okay. So Kant is admitting that, things exist in the world, and things change in the world, and things can only change if time exists. Okay. He continues, time is certainly something real, namely, the real form of inner intuition. But how does it change outer, ears of corn and stuff? Time, therefore, has subjective reality, with regard to inner experience. That is, I really have the representation of time and my determination in it. Time, therefore, is to be considered as real, though not as an object, but as the manner of representing which I myself, as an object, possess. I really have the representation of time and my determinations in it. Time, therefore, is to be considered as real, though not as an object, but as the manner of representing which I myself, as an object, possess. Interesting. So I possess time. Okay. And presumably that's how I experience it. And that's how things change, but the time doesn't, if that makes sense. Or the concept of time doesn't change, but things can change outside me. If either I myself or any other being could intuit me without this condition of sensibility, then these very determinations, which we now represent to ourselves as alterations, would provide a kind of knowledge in which the representation of time, and therefore also of alteration, would not enter at all. Yeah, I'll read it again. You guessed it. If either I myself or any other being could intuit me without this condition of sensibility, then these very determinations which we now represent to ourselves as alterations would provide a kind of knowledge in which the representations of time, and therefore also of alteration, would not enter at all. Okay, effectively, if we could intuit things outside of time, then the idea of alterations would not be a thing, I guess. There only remains, therefore, the empirical reality of time as condition of all our experiences, while absolute reality cannot. Oh, it's back to this kind of thing where it's like, okay, if you could, if you could experience, let's just say, take alteration out of it and just say, if you could experience a thing outside of time, that banana on the table, then you would be experiencing it as a thing in itself outside of time, and time would be irrelevant, and no alterations would ever occur. But as soon as you introduce time, I guess you also have to introduce perception, and as a result, oh God, I kind of lost the thread. And as a result of that, I'm not going to find it, but I was almost there. But it's very similar to the previous argument he was making. In other words, like, time is, the alteration is largely based on human perception and experience, which is totally entrenched in time. But there is effectively a version of time, or like, if you were able to experience a thing in itself outside of time, then that wouldn't occur. One, because time wouldn't exist, but also because your perception of it wouldn't exist. Meaning, time, the constant there is not necessarily time, but actually perception, and the fact that time is within me, and I'm the variable. Like, I am the constant there, not the variable. Okay, I think there only remains, therefore, the empirical reality of time, our experience, as condition of all our experiences, while absolute reality cannot, according to what has just been shown, be granted to it. Okay, that makes sense. Meaning, like, time doesn't exist, for things in themselves. The only way that we know or experience or can understand time is through ourselves. And therefore, it's not alteration, like, the alteration doesn't belong to time, it rather belongs to our perception. That's the constant there, not time. Maybe time exists in a different way to other things, or as a thing in itself, but that's kind of irrelevant. That's why he can grant the argument and dismiss it, because maybe it doesn't function that way as a thing in itself. Okay. Time is nothing but the form of our inner intuition. Take away from time the special condition of our sensibility, and the concept of time vanishes as well. Time does not adhere to the objects, but only to the subject that intuits them. Okay, we got there. It took us a while, but I think I'm there. The reason why this objection is raised so unanimously, and even by those who have nothing very tangible to say against the doctrine of the ideality of space, is this. They cannot hope to prove apodictically the absolute reality of space, for they are confronted by idealism, according to which the reality of external objects does not admit of strict proof. The reality of the object of inner sense, the reality of myself and of my state, on the other hand, is immediately evident through our consciousness. Okay, so meaning people are like, okay, I can't know the phone in and of itself. I don't have access to the inner workings of the phone, or like the consciousness of the phone, or the particles, but like the objection to time is like, it exists within myself, and I'm able to know thyself. So people object to the time aspect of that more than the space aspect of that. Okay. The former might be a mere illusion, but the latter, according to their opinion, is undeniably something real, meaning their soul themselves. They did not see, however, that both of them, without denying their reality as representations, belong nevertheless only to appearance, which always has two sides. The one where the object is considered in itself. So effectively, like, you yourself, you and your mind and everything also has, what we experience, and is presented to the world and experienced by you, the appearance, and maybe its true thing in itself state. Okay. I'm going to restart that sentence because I interrupted it. They did not see, however, that both of them, without denying their reality as representations, belong nevertheless to appearance, which always has two sides. The one where the object is considered in itself, without regard to the manner in which it is intuited, its constitution, therefore, remaining always problematic. The other, where the form of the intuition of this object is taken into consideration, which form is not to be sought in the object in itself, but in the subject to which the object appears, and which yet belongs really and necessarily to the appearance of this object. Time and space are therefore two sources of knowledge from which a variety of synthetic knowledge can be drawn a priori. Pure mathematics gives a splendid example of this with respect to our knowledge of space and its relations. As time and space, taken together, are pure forms of all sensible intuition, they render synthetic a priori propositions possible. But precisely thereby, that they are merely conditions of our sensibility, these a priori sources of knowledge determine their own limits, namely, that they apply to objects only insofar as these are considered as appearances, which are, I'm editorializing, dependent on us experiencing them, but do not present things in themselves. This is the only field in which these a priori sources of knowledge are valid. Beyond it, no objective use can be made of them. This reality of space and time, however, leaves the reliability of empirical knowledge quite untouched. Right. For we are equally sure of it, whether these forms are necessarily adherent to things in themselves or only to our intuition of these things. Those, on the other hand, who maintain the absolute reality of space and time, whether as subsisting or only as inhering, must come into conflict with the principles of experience itself. For if they assume space and time to be subsisting, which is generally the view of mathematical students of nature, then they have to assume two eternal and infinite self-subsisting non-entities, space and time, which exist, yet without there being anything real, only in order to encompass all that is real. But kind of saying, like, I don't have to do that because I think it's just based on my intuition of it. And, like, I make the reality, and I just experience things as they are presented to me. I don't have to act like space and time, these two infinite and self-subsisting non-entities, like, actually exist in the world. Okay. If they take the second view, held by some metaphysical students of nature, and regard space and time as relations of appearances, Leibniz, concurrent or successive, which are abstracted from experience, but represented confusedly in their separation, then they are obliged to deny that mathematical a priori doctrines have any validity with regard to real things, for instance, things in space, or at least to deny their apodictic certainty. Right, because, like, their things can't be true unless they are actually, like, experienced in space and time. Because it's relational, therefore you have to have points on the spectrum in order to measure and understand, I think is the point he's making. For a posteriori, no such certainty is to be found, and according to this opinion, the a priori concept of space and time are merely creatures of our imagination. Their sources, they hold, must really be sought in experience. Imagination framing out of the relations abstracted from experience, something that, while it contains what is general in these relations, yet cannot exist without restrictions which nature has connected with them. The mathematical students of nature gain so much that they keep the sphere of appearances free for mathematical propositions. On the other hand, they become bewildered by these very conditions as soon as the understanding endeavors to go beyond this sphere. The metaphysical students have this advantage, that they do not get bewildered by the representations of space and time when they wish to judge of objects not as appearances, but only in relation to the understanding. But they can neither account for the possibility of a priori mathematical knowledge, for they lack a true and objectively valid a priori intuition, nor bring the propositions of experience into necessary agreement with those a priori mathematical propositions. On our theory, the true character of these two original forms of sensibility, both difficulties vanish. Okay. Lastly, transcendental aesthetic cannot contain more than these two elements, namely space and time. This is evident from the fact that all other concepts belonging to sensibility, even that of motion, which unites both elements, presuppose something empirical. Motion presupposes the perception of something movable. In space, however, considered in itself, there is nothing movable. Consequently, the movable must be something that is found in space only through experience, and must therefore be an empirical datum. Datum. Like datum. D-A-T-U-M. Similarly, transcendental aesthetic cannot count the concept of alteration among its a priori data, because time itself does not alter, but only something which is in time. The concept of alteration requires the perception of something that exists, and of the succession of its determinations. In other words, it requires experience. Ooh, okay, that was an hour. How many pages do we actually read? Okay, it's not bad. Did we get through 10 pages? I would take that in an hour. Oh, no, we got through more. 11? Yeah, 11 pages. That's not bad. So it's going to take me another hour to read section 8. Okay. I feel like I got that better than I typically would have understood it reading by myself. I read it. Oh gosh, this might be my 5th time reading this part. But yeah, it was great.